Are the Ottomans colonizers in North Africa?
You're asking tough ones, huh? Look, I'll reply to this one. Absolutely. For the ones who will be listening to this interview and the ones who want to become historians, there's so much to do about the history of North Africa to decolonize it.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Mohamed Oualdi, who is a full professor of history at Sciences Po in Paris and is the author of A Slave Between Empires, which came out in 2020, published by Columbia University Press. Mohamed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mickey, for having me.
I came across your book online, I think maybe in 2021, and immediately thought to myself, I need to have this person on the series because, just speaking for myself, I feel like the history of slavery in the Arab world is a topic that I know very little about and is a topic that I think I need to know a lot about. So I guess my first question is, how much about the history of slavery did you know growing up? Was this also sort of this big blind spot for you?
Well, it's an interesting one to start with. I mean, yeah, clearly I started to be interested by slavery when I started to write my dissertation, to prepare my dissertation, which is like maybe 2 decades ago. I'm kind of old now. So yeah.
We're getting old.
How old am I?
No, I said we're getting old. We're getting old.
We're getting old. So absolutely. So no, I mean, at that time, I didn't have any clue about slavery in the Muslim world. And for my dissertation, I started to work on the Mamluks, but for Tunisia. I mean, you know that most of the people would know that in Egypt, you had Mamluks who were in charge of the government from maybe the 13th century to Muhammad Ali, the beginning of the 19th century. So yeah, I didn't have any clue. But just to say that people tend to think that there is no work about slavery in the Muslim world or in the Arab world, or that there is a taboo or silence about slavery in the Arab world, which is completely wrong. I mean, it's not, I mean, if you look at the novels written in Arabic or in French or in English about the Arab world and slavery, you will find plenty of them. Even for the 1960s, there are at least 2 Moroccan novelist writers who wrote about slavery. Fan al-Mahdi by a Moroccan historian, a Moroccan nationalist who became a major novelist, Al-Ghalab, is like one of these novels that has been published in the 1960s. That's quite impressive. And even if you go back to the Ottoman Empire, there is by 1911 a novel written by an Ottoman subject who is a Qadi about slavery and a woman who has been enslaved, who is a major character of his novel. So on this side, I mean, if you think about novels and books, you have all these books which have been written about enslaved people. On the other hand, you have academic books about slavery. And so, I mean, since maybe the 1970s, 1980s, you have major historians publishing in English about slavery. So just to tell the name of Ehud Toledano, or Yves Powell, this is indeed academics. They are not that much known, but they have written extensively about slavery in the Ottoman Empire. And then you could add to these novels and academic books all the dissertations that have been written in major universities in the Arab world. But the problem for this kind of third sort of book is that most of them have not been published. They remained as dissertations in academic libraries. So you see what I mean? So indeed, it's a sensitive topic, indeed. And there is censorship. And there are people who want to avoid this topic, mostly because it's related to anti-Black racism. But novelists, academics have produced knowledge about slavery. Just to add, just a, a major kind of anecdote is that by the 1990s in Morocco, a book by Mohammed al-Neji, which was written in French and then translated into Arabic about slavery in Morocco, has been a huge success in the Moroccan context. So it's not as if we didn't have a story of knowing about slavery, but from time to time, people want to think that it has been a major silence, a major taboo. It has been censored, it's sensitive, but there are plenty of books about slavery in the Muslim world.
Muhammad, I'm going to ask you a really simple question. What is the definition of slavery?
Okay, so like the first kind of definition would be to say that a slave is someone who is not free. I mean, that's a classical one, and everyone can get it, and it's really related as well to the Islamic legal definition of slavery, where in fact you are becoming a slave when you become a captive in a war between Muslim armies and non-Muslim armies. And a non-Muslim person can be enslaved because he's not Muslim and because he's seized in a context of war. So freedom can be a first definition. The second definition is that you are possessed by someone else. You are the Mamluk of someone else. I mean, you are owned by someone else, no? So it's ownership. And this is extremely important as well in the Islamic legal context, where a slave is at the same time an object and a person. An object that can be owned by someone else and a person that has some legal rights. A third definition, in addition to freedom and ownership, is a definition that the US sociologist Orlando Patterson has really kind of emphasized. The idea that a slave is someone that doesn't have any social life, that is excluded from the social life, and that is often humiliated and excluded from the social life. And this could be a third definition because, in fact, a slave is often someone, like for a slave, this is the master who is deciding for many aspects of his life or her life. A slave in the Muslim context cannot be married to someone else without the agreement of his master or her mistress. This is extremely important. So just to reply to this simple question, 3 definitions related to slavery: freedom or lack of freedom, ownership, and the social humiliation and the social death.
Over the course of basically, if I look at the period that you studied, does that definition change?
No, that's an excellent one. I mean, from the beginning of Islam and the shaping of Islamic law to the 19th century, most of the people are referring to this Islamic legal framework made of Quran, Hadith, and interpretations related to legal cases. And that will create some specific Islamic schools of interpretation of law. This is like a definition that from the start is related either to the notion of freedom or ownership. But then by the 19th century and by the colonial period in the 19th century and 20th century, then with the abolition of slavery, I mean, let's say the legal abolition of slavery or the manumission of slaves, who is a slave and who is not a slave? For instance, in North Africa, and I'm much more studying North Africa than the Levant and the Middle East, you have North African subjects who have been colonized either by France, by Italy, or by Spain, who would complain that they are becoming slaves. They are free people indeed. They are Muslim people who have a sort of legal freedom, but they would complain that they are treated as slaves in the colonial context. And you see that even nowadays, I mean, when NGOs are defining some specific workers in the Middle East as slaves because they are not paid and because they have so few legal rights. So in this sense, the definition of slavery is changing. And many people would say in the daily life that some people are slaves because they are not paid. But from the medieval period to the modern period, to the 19th century, there was a legal definition about slavery, which was kind of an Islamic legal definition, which was precise and which was related to freedom and ownership. Nowadays, I think that the definition of slavery is a bit vague and broad for different reasons to include many forms of human trafficking.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about your first book that looks at the Mamluks in Tunis from 1630 until the 1880s. Do you mind just giving a brief introduction to the subject of that book and sort of the main conclusions?
Yeah, so people might know that in Egypt you had many Mamluks who were in charge of the Egyptian government from the 13th century, then to the 16th century. And by the 16th century, the Ottoman government from Istanbul took over Egypt. And then the Mamluks remained as a major force, but they were no longer in charge of Egypt. So Tunisia, it can be compared to Egypt to a certain extent. I mean, I don't want to offend Egyptians because they think that they are the center of the Arab world, but just to say that even Tunisia, which is a small part of the Ottoman Empire, by 1574 to 1881, had Mamluks. What is a Mamluk? I mean, in the Arab world, means that this is a man, often a man, who is owned by someone else. Okay? So these Mamluks in Egypt, as well as in Tunisia, some of them came from the Caucasus. They were Cherkess people who were both in Istanbul or in Izmir or in other parts of the center of the Ottoman Empire, then to be brought to Tunisia or to Egypt. And they will be sold as kids coming from the center of the Ottoman Empire to be raised in Tunisia or in Egypt or in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. And so they were raised to become Muslim people and as well to be trained as members of the administrations or officers in the armies. So you see, I mean, these are slaves that you are purchasing to become your main servants in the state. And so you had that as well in Tunisia from the 16th century to the 19th century. So the book is about maybe about 100 people.
Hamid, before you keep on going, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Why the Caucasus? Why did they bring slaves from the Caucasus?
So you had so that's an interesting one. I mean, that just to say that there was a tradition in the Caucasus where people will send or sell their kids to other people. This is related to the form of the society in the Caucasus among the Cherkess people. Since the 13th century, there is a tradition to sell and send your kids away, to hope that they will have a better life, okay? But among the Mamluks, there were not only people coming from the Caucasus or from the Cherkess region. There were as well people who were from Georgia, close to the Caucasus, who were sold after some raids against Georgian people, who were Christian people. But as well in North Africa, some of the Mamluks came from Italy, from Corsica, from France, from Spain. And so they were enslaved either on boats circulating throughout the Mediterranean, or they were enslaved after some raids against some villages in Italy, on the seaside, or in Spain, or in Malta, or in France. And so you would bring all these European people, and then you will enslave them, and then some people among these enslaved men and kids would choose to convert to Islam. So you see, the world of the Mamluks in the early modern period and the 19th century is made of people coming from the Caucasus, but as well from Western Europe, who were converted to Islam. So all these people were trained either as kids or as grown up to become part of the Ottoman state in North Africa or in Egypt, but let's focus on Tunisia. And so one of the main goal of the book was to understand why did the sovereigns of that time choose Mamluks to be in charge of the Tunisian country or the Egyptian country. So this is a major paradox of slaves who are governing free people in Tunisia or in Egypt. This has been seen as the Mamluk paradox. How can we explain that slaves are in charge of free people? So one of the explanation by, how to say that, Orientalistic or Islamophobic academics has been to say that in Islam, rulers do not trust free people. They have to rely on enslaved men and women. And there is like a sharp contrast between the state and the society. There is a divide, according to this interpretation, between state and society. And this is why, Islamic societies and Islamic states can only be authoritarian states, because there is no civil society or no tradition of civil society in the Muslim world. This is their own interpretation. Indeed, I do disagree with this kind of interpretation, which is really kind of insulting and not clearly understanding what was the history of the Muslim world, which is a diverse history. So I'm not saying that the Mamluks do represent the symbol of this divide between state and society. In the book about the Mamluks in Tunisia, I show that indeed Mamluks could be used by the Ottoman governors of Tunisia to create a distinction between the Ottoman power in Tunisia and the Tunisian society. But some of the Mamluks were also used to create social connections, other forms of social connections between the state and the society. For instance, you have the case of a major Mamluk coming from Moldavia by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. His name was Yusuf Sahab Taba. He was a major character in the history of Tunisia by the beginning of the 19th century because he did build a major neighborhood close to the Medina, to the major city of Tunis. And when building this part of the city, he had to rely on local Tunisian work and on their own kind of knowledge. So you see what I mean? So this kind of interpretation that says that Mamluks are a clear sign of a divide between state and society in Tunisia is not really kind of precise. It's not nuanced. And if you see like the social lives of Mamluks in Ottoman Tunisia, you see that they're creating bonds between the state and the society. And I should add that they have played a major role in reforming Ottoman Tunisia by the 19th century.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question. This goes back to the beginning, my first question, which is, what were your blind spots? When I think about the role that slavery, the way in which slavery was a part of society, part of the economy, part of the political structure, political life, I should say, in a place like Tunisia. The way you're describing it now, it seems like it was an integral part of all of those aspects of life. So where does the disconnect happen? Why is it that somebody like you or like me, growing up in the 20th and now living in the 21st century, could possibly have such a big blind spot about something that was so integral to political life, daily life, economic activity? When did that blind spot begin to emerge, or was it always this shadowy thing that people didn't like to talk about?
No, that's really interesting one. Thank you so much for this one. Um, Look, I would say that maybe the colonial period is extremely important to understand why we no longer see this past or this long history of slavery in the Muslim or the Arab world. Why the colonial period? Because by the colonial period, you have the abolition of slavery, or at least some of the colonial powers did fight against enslavement in the Muslim world with some specific agenda. But by the colonial period, North African colonized subjects were suffering from the colonial violence, and it became like the major agenda in their political life. So all this suffering is extremely important, and we, as Arabs or North Africans or Middle Easterners, we tend to look at the history of the Arab world for the 20th century. We don't go that far, like in the 19th century or the Ottoman period. People are much more interested by the colonial period and the post-colonial period than by the pre-colonial period. And slavery was extremely important for the pre-colonial period. This is like a first explanation. It's that we are not really looking at a long history of slavery. We are much more focusing on the present time, on our current history. So that might be a first reason why we don't look, or we didn't see slavery as part of the social fabric of these countries. That's the first explanation. The second explanation is that even though we as historians are focusing on slavery, slaves did represent less than 5% of the population. They were mostly, you could find them mostly in the cities, in major Ottoman cities or medieval cities of, let's say, Tunis, for instance. And so then what is complicated is to find primary sources about slaves. And these slaves were coming from different regions. So you had black slaves and white slaves. So I think this is maybe why we didn't really see or look, or were not that much interested by this component of the history of the Muslim world. But I'm just trying to thinking out loud, because it is a major question. Or maybe because what we have been learned at school, what we have been learning at school, was less about slavery than about Islam, nationalism. It was less about the subaltern people. And you can see that as well about North African nationalism or nationalism in the Middle East, is that they didn't want to make a distinction between people, either in terms of race or in terms of social class. And one of the major challenges, let's say at least for North Africa, is to think about what happened to black people, either in North Africa and the Middle East, who were local citizens, who were as well colonized subjects. And how is it that nationalists erased this difference from their speeches and from their political agenda? I mean, we can understand that their major goal was to unite the people and to fight colonialism. But by doing so, they have erased or silenced this part of our own history. And a major challenge is to bring back this history of black local people. You see what I mean?
When do you think anti-black racism became part of slavery in North Africa? Because if the Mamluks were primarily coming from the Caucasus, was there a specific shift? Was there a slave trade industry that started shifting their focus with an intent to make money? You know, did an industry emerge at some point that was born out of anti-black racism?
Look, clearly, the slave trade from the Sahara started in the medieval period, quite early. So it's quite important. It's a major part of slavery in North Africa, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. And this is something I should have started with, but just to say that we have, like historians, have a deep consciousness of this part of slavery. Now, the conversation about slavery in the Muslim world and anti-Black racism is indeed a sensitive one. So, on the one hand, one should acknowledge the fact that even though there were different sorts of slaves, white slaves, black slaves, slaves from Europe, slaves from the Caucasus, slaves as well from Asia, slaves from sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, we see that. So it's different from the US context or the colonial American context. So we had different forms of slaves. So saying that, at the same time, we should acknowledge that in, let's say, the North African societies, during the early modern period and the 19th century, what we see is that even if we had, and if we could see different slaves coming from different societies and from different races, then we have as well to acknowledge that the subaltern slaves in the North African context were mostly black slaves, or men and women who have been enslaved and were coming from Western Africa or Eastern Africa. So you see, it's a complicated topic because it's not the US and it's not the history of the US, but at the same time, there were processes of racialization that included black people and that excluded them at the same time. And in these kind of processes of racialization, even in terms of the language, I take only the case of North Africa that I know better, but you know the word abid is the plural of abd, which is the plural of slave indeed. But abid in the North African context and maybe in other contexts is like equals black. So there is this notion that indeed slavery was overlapping with blackness. And in this sense, there is a process of racialization. So what am I trying to say here is to be clear. It's not the same history than the history of slavery in the US or in the Americas. And we have to be really cautious in saying that because there is a kind of an attempt at projecting American history into the Muslim world. But saying so, at the same time, we need to acknowledge that even if many people were involved in slavery and trade slaves in the Muslim world, the issue of slavery and blackness and anti-black racism is a major one. And historians like Bruce Holt, Shukri Lemel, have studied as well this creation of racialization against black people and how it was connected to slavery. So we need to be cautious, but it's still a major challenge, and it's still extremely important for us historians and as well for other citizens to unpack and understand the roots of anti-black racism. We have to face it clearly.
I think it's definitely there are nuances that seem to be erased constantly, especially when there's a projection of a Western understanding of a topic, and then almost sometimes well-meaning people who are interested in advocating for highlighting the history of enslaved people and advocating for the idea that we should shed light and understand the very ugly, violent history of slavery in the Americas. Interestingly enough, so oftentimes they take that same history and they superimpose it on other contexts, and thereby minimizing the nuances of stories for people around the world. There's a really a heartbreaking irony there. I want to talk a little bit about, not a little bit, I want to talk about your second book, which is A Slave Between Empires. And it follows the case study of a very interesting person. Before we get into that, let's have you just sort of tell us a little bit about how you fell upon this story and how that turned into a book.
Yeah, just to say like a few words about what you were commenting about how some US academics are trying to impose their own understanding of race and slavery into the Muslim world. I often take it like the case, I'll come back to the other case. I often take the case of the 19th century. In the 19th century, by the beginning of the 19th century, Europeans succeeded to ban the enslavement of other Europeans. So by 1816, Europeans could no longer be enslaved in North Africa. By the mid-19th century, the British succeeded as well to ban the enslavement and the slave trade of people coming from the Caucasus. The only people who remained, people who could be enslaved, were people from sub-Saharan Africa. So it tells you something about how the story of slavery is different in the Mediterranean context and how it's important to recover the long history of anti-Black racism, but by being cautious, by taking into account the local histories of slavery, by taking into account as well what were the words and the social categories that people used to define who is Black and who is a slave. So we are sympathetic to the issue of anti-Black slavery, anti-Black racism in the Arab world. But we are only saying that be cautious and just read the sources. Do your work, and do not impose onto this world this kind of understanding of yours related to your own history. Saying so I'll go back to the character. So I have studied the death and the afterlife of a character who is Hussein bin Abdallah, who is one of the last Mamluks from Ottoman Tunisia. He's interesting because by the 1870s, he lived in Tuscany, in Florence, and he died there in 1888. He died there in 1887, so 6 years after the French took over Tunisia. So he's a really interesting guy because he was born in Circassia, in the Cherkess world, in the Caucasus, brought as he was a child from Cherkess world to Istanbul and then to Tunisia. And so he was trained, became a Muslim in Tunisia, and then became the first mayor of the city of Tunis, the first minister of education as well in Ottoman Tunisia. He was close to a major character in the history of Ottoman Tunisia and the history of the Ottoman Empire, Khayruddin, who was also a slave from the Caucasus. So it's interesting in this sort of long history of slavery and the end of this history of slavery. He's also fascinating because he lived in Italy for more than a decade, let's say 2 decades, where he traveled across Europe, even in the US in the 1860s. So the book is not only about his own trajectory between empires, it's as well his case is useful to understand what happened to a long history of the Ottoman world when Tunisia and North Africa was colonized by the French. Is there any form of Ottoman legacy or Ottoman material culture that was still important for North Africans with the colonial period? I need to explain why I'm studying Hussein bin Abdallah. It's not only for the fantasy of his life and because I want to live in Italy and I'll be living in Florence like him. It's not this kind of fantasy. It's much more that I was trained in France. I've been teaching in France. Then I have been teaching in the US. And often, and this is like not completely related to slavery, it's much more related to colonialism and the legacy of colonialism. Like in the French context, most of my colleagues who are studying French colonial Algeria, how to say that without being too violent, but let's just say that they're studying French colonial Algeria only by looking at what was French in Algeria. They don't look at Algeria in a North African context. They don't look at the local Algerian Muslims according to their own primary sources. They don't really care about the Ottoman past of Algeria. So it's as if we are perpetuating a long history of colonialism and we are not changing the analytical framework. So I'm arguing that if we want to change our perception of colonial North Africa, and if we want to understand the violence of the colonizers in North Africa, we need first to look at the social agenda of the North Africans. We need to locate them in the history of colonization according to their Ottoman past or according to their Islamic past. So the goal is to say, please, you can study colonization in North Africa and you can use French sources, it's fine, but we can do that in a different way, which will be to look at the local sources written by the North Africans and understanding what was their past to better seize and to better understand the impact and the importance of colonial violence.
Muhammad, I want to ask you a question. Are the Ottomans colonizers in North Africa?
You're asking tough ones, huh? Look, I'll reply to this one. Absolutely. I'm just saying that for the ones who will be listening to this interview and the ones who want to become historians, there's so much to do about the history of North Africa to decolonize it. Okay, first. Second, were the Ottomans colonizers? My own reply would be no. I'm sorry for the ones who want to see the Ottomans as colonizers. Why no? In the North African context, the North African Ottoman provinces were hugely, they have like a major autonomy from Istanbul. That's the first. You cannot imagine French people giving some autonomy to the North Africans in the colonial context. French, Italians, and Spanish forces during the colonial period in North Africa, they were absolutely controlling the states and the administration, which was not the case of the Ottomans. The second reason why we have to be really nuanced and not see the Ottomans as colonizers as the French is that the Ottomans didn't have the technology or even like the kind of the political culture to see the North Africans as colonized people. The Ottomans did not develop like a language of cultural superiority, and they didn't see the North Africans as savages. So that's also another difference. Plus, the Ottoman soldiers coming from the center of the Ottoman Empire would integrate within the Ottoman North African societies. They will be part of the North African societies to the point that some Ottoman soldiers, Turkish soldiers coming from Anatolia, from the center of the Ottoman Empire, would marry local North African women and have kids with them. See, in the colonial context, the kind of mixing with the local people was not something that French, Italians, or Spanish people were aiming for. So, see, it's a different world, and I'm not saying that Ottomans were not dominating North African societies. were not as well repressing North African subjects. They did. It's an empire, but it's not a colonial empire. It's a dominant empire that had some effects on North African societies and could be a violent empire. But it's not like, you cannot compare that to the French colonial violence.
Could one argue that the reason why they integrated more and there was more autonomy is just because the empire lasted longer and it was more mature, and so maybe that level of integration and that level of autonomy was achieved over time, whereas the European colonialism was only for a century, maybe?
It's an interesting interpretation. Some would say that North Africa, the Ottomans did not really care about North Africa. Is that it was far from the center, according to this interpretation. And it's not, North Africa is not as rich as Egypt, no? Egypt was central for the Ottoman Empire for different reasons. But that's the first interpretation, that it was far, it could support the Ottoman Empire, but was not that important. They didn't care when the Algerians were colonized in 1830. They could not really support or fight against the French when the Tunisians were colonized in 1881. So that was the first reason. The second reason is Islam. You could say that they are all Muslims in a way, and that some Tunisians in the 16th century were not supporting the Ottomans when they took over Tunisia. But some of those, even in Algeria, saw the Ottomans as this Muslim force that could defend them against the Christians and against Spain, let's say. So this is a second interpretation why, in fact, there was an easier integration of the Ottoman forces in the North African societies. When the French took over Algeria, they were still seen as Rumi people or Christian people, and different from the Algerian people.
Okay, let's go back to the story of the second book, and this idea of empires overlapping and succeeding each other, and how that changes the life of somebody like General Hussein.
Yeah, so by the second half of the 19th century, and this is how, in fact, the relations between Tunisia and the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul changed. By the second half of the 19th century, most of these Ottoman dignitaries in Tunisia, they understand that things are changing, that they might be colonized either by the French, the British, or the Italians. And so some people like Hussein or Khairuddin are getting closer to Istanbul. And they want to have a closer relation with Istanbul that might protect them from the Westerners and from their imperialistic forces. So this is the moment when, in fact, Hussein is trying to become more Ottoman or relying much more on the Istanbul forces. But at the same time, he's traveling across Europe and he's getting a better sense of European technology and European modernity. But his own fight by the 1880s, when Tunisia is colonized by the French, is to bring back the Ottoman, or at least to create a sense of resistance within Tunisia. So that's the main kind of idea. But because by the 1880s, no one is betting that the French will remain in Tunisia. Things can change. But still, he is cultivating the sense of Ottomanness and solidarity with the Ottomans, and the sense of Islamic solidarity.
He becomes a quote-unquote former slave. Is that a term he would ever use to describe himself?
That's an interesting one as well. He defined himself as a Mamluk in one of the letters that he wrote to Khairuddin. And he and Khairuddin and others were part of this group of Mamluk. So he did acknowledge by saying that he was a Mamluk, that he had like a slave legal status at some point. But there is another word which is quite important to define the people who have been manumitted. So a slave who is manumitted by his master is a mawla. And mawla is an important notion in Islamic law because a mawla, a manumitted slave, has much more legal rights than a slave per se. So saying so, he was a mawla, he was not a mamluk, but he did not define himself as a mawla. He was much more a mamluk, meaning a dignitary of the Ottoman province of Tunisia. He had decoration, military decorations, and I think he would define and shape himself much more as a member of the elite, as an official of the Tunisian state than as a slave, clearly. I mean, that was not how he did see himself, at least in the letters. And I mean, this Tunisian elite, and this is part as well about the conversation about, it's connected to race and anti-black racism. People like Hussein were light-skinned people. And in the context of Tunisia, Mamluks from the 18th, 19th century integrated into the Tunisian society. And nowadays, I mean, by the family names, you could know who is like the descendant of the Mamluk or not. Because there are famous families in Tunisia and the elite of the Tunisian society. So in their case, they did not suffer any form of racism. Because they were light-skinned, they adapted to the Tunisian society. And I mean, Hussein didn't have any kids. I mean, he raised two girls, but he did not acknowledge that it was his own. These were his own girls. But people like Hussein, what families in Tunisia? They are part of the Tunisian elite nowadays, and no one will tell them that they have like a past related to slavery, which is completely different from black people, who are seen as descendants of black slaves, when in fact some of them came free to Tunisia. So this is as well the connections between slavery, race, and the history of Hassan bin Abdallah.
Let's talk a little more about that dynamic. When did, or let me say it differently, has slavery ended in Tunisia? And if so, when?
Yeah, I mean, that's as well related to Hassan bin Abdallah. So there is this story and this history that is defended by the Tunisian state nowadays. So in 1846, after a decade of actions against slavery, the Tunisian governor of the Ottoman province, Ahmed Bey, wrote a letter to the major Islamic scholars in Tunisia. And in this letter, he decided that all of the slaves in Tunisia should be manumitted, and that slaves could not be purchased in Tunisia. So this is not abolition, clearly, but this is trying to end slavery through manumission and by shutting down the slave markets in Tunisia. So this has been seen as a major definition that led to the abolition of slavery in Ottoman Tunisia. And this decision of 1846 is now commemorated in Tunisia since 2019. And Hassan bin Abdallah played a role as well in discussing and in celebrating this abolition of slavery in Tunisia, because he as well promoted this decision outside of Tunisia in discussions that he had and in letters that he sent to the U.S. Consul in Tunisia. So Hassan bin Abdallah is part of this idea that Tunisia is an exception in the Muslim world because it was the first country to, not to, let's say, they would say that they abolished slavery, but to be precise, that it was the first country that manumitted most of the slaves in Tunisia, or the aim was to manumit most of the slaves in Tunisia, and was the first country where the slave markets were shut down. So there is this idea of an exception and a sort of Tunisian modernity where Tunisians or the Tunisian officials or the Tunisian state promoted a form of abolition even before the French. So that's part of the history of the 19th century. But one has to be cautious because the 1846 decision did not put an end to slave trade in Tunisia. There were other decisions towards the abolition of slavery by the beginning of the French colonization, and people were still enslaved in the 20th century. And more than that, I mean, the 1846 decision didn't put an end, indeed, to anti-black racism, neither in the 19th century or the 20th century. And so anti-black racism activists in Tunisia are telling us that we need to be cautious. It's not because we are promoting the idea of Tunisia being abolitionist before other countries. And we should not use this kind of history and this kind of exception to, we can promote this kind of abolition or this history, but we have to be extremely cautious in fighting again and again anti-black racism in Tunisia.
I'm curious if you think that the history of slavery that you're talking about in this region is related to the history of the concept of North Africa, this idea of North Africa as a meaningful entity or a meaningful label. Are these two histories intertwined?
You mean like North Africa, or the Arab notion of the Maghreb has being distinct from other parts of Africa and has a history that is shaped as different from the other parts of Africa, has a history that has been seen as Arab or white compared to the other parts of the sub-Saharan Africa. But that's an interesting kind of take. I would say that the notion of Maghreb was invented in the medieval period, in the Abbasid period, and it was a way to look at this margin of the Muslim world from Baghdad, as the western part of the Muslim world. So it's not like as if they wanted to make a distinction between Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. Their goal was to say that this is the western part, Maghreb, of the Muslim world. So it's not completely connected. Now, Abdelmajid Hanoum has a recent book about the invention of North Africa as a colonial category. And his main goal is to say as well that colonial forces in the 19th and 20th centuries did emphasize the notion of North Africa and Maghreb, partly because they wanted to create a distinction between this part of Africa and the other parts of Africa. And this is as well the outcome of North Africans as being part of a different race. And so it's related to race clearly and maybe to slavery. But I wouldn't make like a clear link between the notion of North Africa and race and slavery. But still, I mean, maybe we could explore as well this hypothesis. But just to say as well, connected to that, even if our conversation is about enslavement of black men and women in North Africa, enslavement of people from the Caucasus, from Western Europe. I'm currently working on another project which is about much more the enslavement of North Africans in Europe. And the end of the story by the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Because in the history of Europe, Europeans and European historians of the Mediterranean have much more focused on the enslavement of Europeans in North Africa than the enslavement of North Africans in Europe. And this is quite important because North Africans wrote about their conditions. They wrote letters about the conditions. The second major goal of this project is to show that among North African enslaved people in Europe, you had Muslims and Jews. North African Jews were part of the social fabric of North Africa. You had Muslims and Jews, you had North Africans who converted to Christianity, and as well, you had North African enslaved people in Europe who were dark-skinned and light-skinned. We tend to define North Africans as light-skinned people. That's not true. The people that I found enslaved in Europe as well are dark-skinned people. And this is part as well of our history. So it's another way of telling the history of slavery, anti-black racism, Europe and North Africa.
Amazing. Okay, Muhammad, I want to end with asking for your recommendations. If a 18-year-old student comes to your classroom and says, Professor, I didn't grow up in North Africa, but I want to spend the whole summer reading all about the history, society, culture in North Africa, what are your 5 book recommendations or movie recommendations that you think, or music recommendations that you think, these have to be on your
No,
list
that's
and
an
then you're
excellent
reading and
one.
you're
So
watching
give
it?
me some time and we will think that together. But let's say that, look, I'm an academic, so I will kind of promote academic books. So let's say that if you want to go from one country to another, the best books in English, let's say about Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Libya, have been published by Cambridge University Press. I have no share in Cambridge University Press, but let's say the book about Algeria by James McDougall, History of Modern Algeria, is fantastic. This is a book about 19th century, 20th century Algeria, using much more the local sources that have been written by colonized Algerians. So if you read English, James McDougall, History of Modern Algeria, Cambridge University Press. For Morocco, same publisher, Suzanne Miller, about History of Modern Morocco, major book, extremely. But guys, please be patient with academics. But they are writing extremely interesting books, not easy to read, but really important. The same for Tunisia, Kenneth Perkins, about History of Modern Tunisia. So I will start as well with these academic books. If you read French and you want to read about modern slavery, this is a recent book that I've been publishing, Esclavage dans les mondes musulmans. We are working on an English translation. You might disagree with some of my interpretations. I'm fine with that. Send me your comments. I'll try to improve the next version of the book. Now you have plenty of novels related to North Africa. Kateb Yassine, book about Algeria. I'm now forgetting the title of the book, but Kateb Yassine you should read as a major novelist, quite important. About movies, look, I'm really into Tunisian movies these recent times because they are extremely interesting. But there was a movie, a recent movie about the youth in Tunisia, in a rural region, so-called Sous les Figues. Really, really smart movie, and a recent kind of documentary fiction movie, the Daughters of Olfa, which has been awarded a César and hopefully an Oscar. So really interesting movie. Some people will criticize this movie. It's about Salafism in Tunisia, but more than Salafism, the condition of women, the violence within families. And I think it's nuanced. I think it's sophisticated. Some people criticize this movie. The idea that the movie maker manipulated the actresses, I don't think it's the case, but it's extremely interesting. What else? I mean, that's, I should have prepared this one. So, but this is the first advice that I would give.
No, that's great.
Yeah, and there are plenty of other movies by Nabil Ayouch about Morocco, for instance. It was the history of prostitution in Casablanca. It's really interesting about the colonial Moroccan language and how it has been used by these women. So all of this is extremely, extremely interesting.
Amazing. Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us. People can find the book Slave Between Empires everywhere books are sold. Very easy to find online. This was a real pleasure having you on.
Now, this was my pleasure. Thank you so much for your challenging and excellent questions. Thank you so much.